Welcome to another special report from Catholic Family News. I'm Brian McCall, the editor-in-chief. We have a very special guest today. He is someone whose name is probably familiar to some of our viewers, as we've referred to some of his public statements in some of our news coverage in the past. And we have a very timely topic. Many of you have been posting comments and questions on the state of the traditional Latin Mass, given both church and states movements against it recently. The stories in the United States about the FBI stalking or looking into Latin Mass communities, and then obviously the reports from Rome. So our guest will be Dr. Joseph Shaw, who is in many ways the honorable successor of the late and great Michael Davies. Michael Davies, as many of our viewers know, was really the founders of the English Latin Mass Society, as well as the International Federation Una Voce, that has been around for decades, both organizations promoting and supporting the traditional Latin liturgy, the Leonine Gregorian liturgy of the Roman Church. Dr. Shaw, in addition to serving as the chairman of the Latin Mass Society, a post to which he was elected in 2009, and for the past 2 years at the international level with the International Federation Una Voce, is also an eminent philosopher, something our modern society is much in need of, good philosophers. He was educated at the university level at the University of Oxford, has served as a fellow at St. Benet's Hall, which is part of the University of Oxford system. And I know from personal experience, although many decades ago, also an expert English country dancer. But welcome, Dr. Shaw.
Thank you very much.
And it's a pleasure to have you with us. And today we are, as I mentioned, talking about a book not too long ago, but rather recently published on the liturgy, the family, and the crisis of modernity. Quite a large topic, I guess. So maybe start us off and tell us a little bit about this book, why you're publishing this book at this time in particular.
Well, one practical reason is you mentioned that I was a fellow of St. Benet's Hall in Oxford University, and St. Benet's Hall, Oxford University has ceased to exist. So I have a little bit more time on my hands. The story about the demise of St. Benet's is a very, very sad one, but I won't take up my time. If people want to know what I think about that, you can read me in The Critic.
Yeah.
So I have a bit more time now, which I've used to put this together, partly from already published things, mostly from talks I've given, which have not appeared in print, and some newly composed materials. So it's an attempt to go a bit more deeply into the issues, not just of what's happening right now, but how we built up to this over the past century, and what we can do about it. So it's not just about the liturgy; it's also about what I call the crisis of modernity, which is the increasing not just secularization but atomization, the breakdown of society, breakdown of the fact that we don't know our neighbors, the fact that we live in an isolated way, and this has really come to something of a head with COVID and everything, and the crisis of the liturgy has to be put into that context, I think.
Yes, and there certainly is an extensive amount of context. I think for our viewers who may have read some excellent works on the liturgy, this is putting the liturgy in probably a much more organic, I would say, context. You don't simply make the argument that it is as the traditional liturgy is perhaps aesthetically more pleasing or more appropriate, although it is, but examine its place in recent history from philosophical, sociological backgrounds. So you quote extensively from sociological or anthropological studies and perspectives. So why do you think that's significant? Why is it not enough to simply say, well, this is pretty, or I like this, and to go beyond that?
It's partly because of the arguments made against us that I
Mm,
think this is necessary. So, there's an idea that the traditional Latin Mass is elitist, for example,
mm,
and actually, I think in many ways that's the reverse of the case.
mm,
The Novus Ordo Missae was very much the product of an intellectual elite who thought they knew better than ordinary Catholics, whether in the developed world or in the mission
mm,
field. And they really had no interest in what ordinary Catholics thought. And also, I think very importantly, they had no understanding of how ordinary Catholics engage with the liturgy. And that's something which I'm very keen to bring out, that it's liturgy for Catholics is, of course, a marker of identity, to use sociological language. Um, but it's obviously a lot more than that for Catholic. It's a mark of your spiritual identity. It's how you engage with God in a very important way. And they thought, oh, these ordinary people, they're uneducated people, they can't understand Latin, so it can't be doing anything for them. So they must be kind of ignorant, kind of totem pole worshippers. Um, and of course, that's totally unjust. And in fact, it renders incomprehensible the entire history of the church, where ordinary Catholics have had heroic virtue and been martyred and all sorts of things. And that doesn't make any sense. None of that makes any sense if you take the view that Vatican II liberals took of ordinary Catholics in their relationship with the liturgy. So I want to explain how someone without Latin can engage with the Latin liturgy. And that's something which then feeds into a sociological research which has been done about the liturgy as a marker of identity, and what happens when that's taken away. So we could talk about the spiritual side of it. There's also a sociological side to the Catholic community. It's not just a divine community, it's also a human community. And although it's interesting, liberals like to talk about the human community of the church, they go on and on about it, but they don't seem to understand how it works. And it works through human relationships, about having things in common with other people, having this identity in common with other people. And that was shaped by the Mass. You take the Mass away, and that is hugely weakened.
mm. Actually, in this part of the book to which we're referring, the first part about the liturgy, you make a point that I found very, very intriguing, very enlightening. That there was much talk in the mid 20th century and after about the common man, and as you say, making things
Yeah,
more accessible. But in many ways, the intellectual elites have a very particular way of thinking that is very verbal based, very
yeah,
language based,
yeah,
conceptual based, and in many senses, as I think you argue, they were sort of imposing their way of interacting, this
yeah.
intellectual way. On everyone who may have different ways. So maybe could you elaborate on that point? I found that very enlightening.
Well, if I'd been if I was an American, I was writing this in America, then I suppose I would have felt compelled to use the analogy of the whole Trump phenomenon.
Ah,
The whole basket of
yes,
deplorables. The
yes.
guys without college degrees, all those sorts of things, without wanting to ally myself to any particular
Hmm,
political solution to the problems that those people
yes.
have. The fact is that it's obviously true. The whole
Hmm,
what Trump demonstrated sociologically is
hmm,
that there's an awful lot of people out there who've been ignored
hmm,
by the elite, and this happened in the 1960s. Well, it's always
hmm,
happened to some extent. I suppose this is life. Maybe this is just life, but there's a particular problem with the 1960s culture that this is not controversial, but the liberal elite, liberal people letting go of their heritage, letting go of their moral norms,
hmm,
embracing new sexual lifestyles, all those sorts of things. Actually, they were a very small minority of people,
hmm,
but they were very, very influential. So they did that. They thought it was great. And then they tried to impose it on everyone else by changing the law, by changing clothing fashions, everything. And everyone else had to kind of deal with the fact that they were living in this new world, which they hadn't asked for. and which actually had a terrible effect on their family structures, and of course there's parallel processes going on in economics with jobs, jobs that were available and all those sorts of things. And they didn't have the resources that the elite had to make up for what was being destroyed. So, liberal Catholics, they have a very intellectual approach to the faith. And it's curious because I think sometimes it would be quite resistant to this idea. And I remember when I was doing theology and stuff, the liberals was always talking about, we must get away from propositional faith. Mm-hmm. Actually, they have a very intellectual engagement with the faith. It's all about words. It's all about propositions. It's all about, do you believe this and do you believe that? And they have a social network, which is not neighborhood based. It's based on people they went to college with, who are probably in different continents by now. And the ordinary Catholic, you can't say to ordinary Catholics, even to kind of people like me, actually, I can't live like that. Most people can't live like that. And there's no way I can kind of snap out of being a kind of horrible, old-fashioned kind of Catholic. I've got to have people I can talk to. I've got to have people I can kind of relate to, and I've got to have a kind of an emotional and spiritual and deep kind of connection with the prayer and the faith and everything. I can't just live in a kind of totally intellectual way, even though I am an intellectual. I mean, I have had, in fact, an intellectual, formation in my education, I suppose.
No, that's again very intriguing point, and I agree with you. Obviously, whatever one thinks of Donald Trump was a very complex historical figure, but he did tap into a sense of being ignored or left behind in the very sort of intellectualization of everything, of politics, religion, liturgy, etc.
Yeah.
But there's actually another theme I'd like to pick up on that I found interesting, and as far as I know, I don't think you drew this conclusion, although I may have missed it in the book. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But in your section that talks about the family and gender roles, and I have to commend you. It's a brave person to take on those topics. I know from personal experience, there's nothing that increases the ire of opponents than touching on those issues. But in that, you have a very interesting chapter on, again, sociologically, one of the things connected to the abuse crisis, which you handle very, very delicately, is this concept of consent entering into as the catch-all for anything goes. So in other words, there's no, to summarize your argument, no objective substantive criteria to acceptable behavior beyond consent of participating parties. And again, I think a very keen and not totally controversial observation. I mean, there are others who have obviously rely upon. But what I found interesting about that discussion is that the complete disconnection of that concept from what happened to the liturgy. So sort of anything is possible with consent, but we can throw away an immemorial liturgy to which there are deep psychological and religious connections without anyone's consent. And again, I think you do touch on this a little bit in that the people didn't really want this. But do you think there's sort of an interesting contradiction in the liberals, in many cases, who promote consent in one sphere, but not very interested in it in another?
Well, of course, there's a difference of generation.
Yes.
This liturgical reform was going on. Basically, it's the ideas of the 1950s being applied in the 1960s and coming to fruition in the 1970s. So in those days, a paternalistic attitude was much more intellectually respectable. And if you see, how the liberals are approaching, the next stage of reform, which they'd like to do, it's through this synod and synodality, which is all about involvement and consultation. And now, of course, it's very problematic the way they're doing it, but it's I think that that's a reflection on the changing intellectual fashions. That this obsession with consent. Of course, you did have people when people were talking about that in the 50s and 60s, but in the sexual sphere. But it's become everything. It's become, so as I said in the book,
Yes.
the idea has arisen that you can squeeze the whole of morality out of the concept of consent. That everything is okay if all the parties agree to it. It doesn't matter whether it's chopping off healthy limbs or engaging in some sort of sexual practice or being killed. It's all fine if people consent. And there's, the objective moralities has kind of disappeared completely from that. And this puts all the focus onto the individual consenting, and which becomes very problematic if there's any kind of, persuasion, pressure, lack of alternatives. And we're seeing, they're seeing this really being tragically demonstrated in Canada with the euthanasia.
Yes.
Again and again, we have people, I've got absolutely no alternative. No one's offering me proper care. No one's offering me medical treatment. I'm not being looked after. I've got no food. My house is falling down. Oh, but I can sign this form and have myself killed.
Yes.
And well, actually, it doesn't sound quite so unattractive if everything else is taken away. But what kind of consent is that?
Yes.
And that's so. Obviously,
No,
it's
and I'm actually happy in that connection. You mentioned the synods on the ever regressive synod. Yes, because in many ways you make an interesting point about one of the problems in squeezing, as you say, all morality out of consent is that consent is not this simple on-off switch, consent, non-consent. And you give wonderful examples of children and people who, okay, there may be an apparent consent, but is it really is it voluntary? Is it informed? And in many ways with the synod, that's very similar, in my view. Oh, yes, everyone's consented to this construct that I've created and you're placed into, and almost given a false dichotomy. Would you like this or this? Oh, now you've consented. So I don't, do you see a similar connection with that process?
Well, yeah, because it's well, not to put too fine a point on it, it's totally manipulated. It's people know what result they want and they set out to do it, and they're very clever about it. But it's a totally empty process. Obviously, it's not exactly the same in the different spheres, but it's just window dressing to say that it's consent.
Yes.
I think it's. The contrast with the liturgical form era is interesting, and I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right. It is an interesting thing because that's the era of paternalism. That's the era in which they were knocking down the slums and rehousing people in wonderful new things, high-rise blocks. And it was going to be happy here, and they all hated it.
Yes,
they hated it, and they were desperate to get out. And it was, and it caused all sorts of, and they were right, of course. It was it exacerbated social breakdown, and the experts were idiots, and they were wrong, and they insisted on it, and they refused to apologize or go back on it, and they're still doing the same thing 50 years later, and it's just very frustrating to say the least. And that the liturgical form fits very much into that mindset.
And somewhat related to that as well, if we look at more modern times, we'll get to maybe at the end what's happening right now, but the current Holy Father, Pope Francis, again has expressed some to me at least puzzling statements about people who go to the traditional Latin Mass. And I'm paraphrasing, not to quote him, but sometimes almost a bewilderment. Why would people still be going to this? This seems why young people, there must be, and again, not quite this, but it's sort of a suggestion there must be something wrong. But in this age of consent, it's sort of an interesting phenomenon that I see in that you can consent, but then when you consent to something I think is not appropriate, wait, the consent must not be a very valid way of testing it, because you do a lot of empirical work, again, focused primarily in England, where you are, but on demographics and what's happened with the church, and again using that principle of consent. What have the people spoken in a sense about the liturgical changes?
Well, they've left.
Yes.
Yes. So, and this is. I started thinking about this some years ago, and the numbers were grim. But now, since COVID, it's like we've had 10 years of decline rolled into 1 year.
Yes.
It's terrifying.
Mm.
It's no longer grim. It's absolutely terrifying.
Mm.
I heard a remark actually of a senior prelate in this country, and someone asked him, "Well, how does he see the church in 20 years' time?" And he said, "I want to go away and hide." And then he said, "Oh, no, I was just joking." But I think that he wasn't just joking, actually.
Yes.
I can quite imagine that. And then he started going on about how it's going to be a smaller, purer church. Oh, it's going to be great. It's going to be great because there's going to be so few people and we're all going to know each other by their first names. But yes, it's they voted with their feet, but of course it is complex, and I go into the complexities, and all the people say, "Oh, well, it's a sociological." Yeah, it is a sociological phenomenon, and therefore you should be taking the sociology of this seriously. And the people who do take it seriously are saying, "Look, this liberal model of the church community doesn't work because all the emphasis is on facing outwards." And actually, if you're going to have a community, you've got to face inwards, because that's what a community is. A community is a group of people who have more to do with each other than they have to do with outsiders. I mean, that's obviously, that must be the case. So,
yes.
If you keep stressing, go out, stop talking to each other, go out and talk to non-Catholics, marry non-Catholics, go to school with non-Catholics, destroy all the connections between your fellow Catholics, you are destroying the community. And yes, slum clearance did that. The television has done that. The higher rates of people going to university have done that, and the church couldn't stop those processes, but the church has made them worse.
Yes. No, I think it's a good perspective you put on that, because many times I've heard a debate from extremes. So maybe those who support positions I might agree with say, it's all the destruction of the traditional Latin Mass. But for that, we'd be in this Elysium. And then on the other side, had absolutely nothing to do with it. In fact, if we didn't change it, everything would have been much worse.
Yeah.
Where again, I think you're absolutely right. The reality is much more complex. There were historical, sociological forces at work, but the church, as a very influential institution on the human level, at least, could either support those movements or provide some resistance. And I think that's the broader, the more pointed question: which of those actually happened? Because the either extreme are probably wrong. But maybe if we could shift a little more personally, and so our viewers get to know the person behind the book a little bit. You do talk, and you and I were born about a year apart, I believe, so we have a similar experience with these historical events in terms of the decades of the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. But you talk a little bit about your own personal experience with the Latin Mass. I think in your youth, I don't think you say it exactly this way, but seeing the man behind the curtain in the oratory briefly. Then coming to eventually, as you matured, coming to a deeper commitment. So, what was it? If you can maybe share briefly with our viewers, what brought you to be a regular adherent to, obviously supporter. You're professionally working in organizations to support it, but how did you come to treasure the traditional Latin Mass, and maybe just give us a little insight into that process?
Yes, well, it's as I said earlier, I'm an intellectual. I'm an academic. I've got 4 degrees, but it was not an intellectual process. Some people discover it through books and things, but I didn't. I mean, I was sympathetic to the idea, and for one, and I thought, well, if it's happening somewhere I can go to, which it finally was advertised as happening in Oxford, where I was living. I'd love to go and see it. So I went along, and I was completely taken aback by actually experiencing it for not quite the first time, but the first time kind of properly. And I thought, I've got to come back. And it's difficult to articulate, because it was a profound experience. I mean, I wouldn't say it was kind of like a religious experience, like a kind of private revelation or anything like that. It was
Mm.
just, this is something which is really kind of, well, this is an act of worship. So this is something being offered to God, which is really solemn and impressive. And you didn't know it was happening in inauspicious circumstances, in a room, in a hired room, in a municipal
Yes.
kind of meeting room. And I think people discover the mass in different ways, but I think a lot of people discover it that way, that they kind of go along to it and they think, gosh, this is not quite what I expected. I can engage with this in a different way. Sometimes people find it difficult. They have to kind of make adjustments. And I think that's, depending on how successfully perhaps they've participated in the Novus Ordo, how much they've got into that. Because it is different. And there's no denying it. It's different.
Yes.
And I went along there with my fiancée, now my wife, and she wasn't bowled over it at all the same way. I mean, she said, "Well, if you want it, that's fine. I'll go along." But
right.
Eventually, she now feels the same, and she did after I don't know how long it was, how many months, or a couple of years. But it's for me, it was very deep and profound, and it's. I say this, as I say, I know I write tons and tons of stuff, and I read and I think about arguments, and I've been reading essays written by students for 15 years. So I'm all about words, but actually this wasn't about words. My Latin isn't very good. At that time, it was non-existent. So I just went in and didn't have a missile, and I didn't understand a single word, not a syllable. Not really. And it didn't matter, because it was this thing that was being offered to God, which I could kind of partake in. And it didn't matter what the words were precisely. I could see basically what was going on. And it was, and this also a sense of solidarity with the other people there. Even though we weren't kind of shaking each other's hands and joining in and all that sort of stuff. So it's I suppose perhaps this is it, that I found something too deep for words in the Catholic liturgy, and that's what it should be. That's what it should be. It should go beyond words, and the attempt to articulate it in the Novus Ordo, which was sincere, and they had their reasons to do it, to try, but it's quite an odd thing to do, because the whole point of the Catholic faith is that it goes beyond that, it goes beyond words, and it can't be reduced to words, but it's, of course, the Novus Ordo is not reduced to words either. I mean, you still have the sacrament, you have the sacrifice and everything, but there's been an attempt to articulate it, and it doesn't really help. Actually, it can impede.
Yes. No, you brought a smile as I read that your description of Mass in the municipal building, because although we were based in London, there was one Sunday we did travel to Oxford, and I believe you weren't there that day because there was a First Communion elsewhere in Oxford, where I think you were. But I distinctly remember this Mass because the priest, who was a excellent liturgist, it was always perfectly celebrated Mass, but the moment of the quiet of the consecration in this bleak municipal building, I realized there was a karate class going on in the next room, and this sort of shriek of a yell as someone pounded to the floor. And at that moment, I just thought, this is what St. Athanasius meant by "they have the buildings, we have the faith." If something so beautiful could speak in this context, it really was one of those moments, as you said, not intellectual, but just the contrast, and just struck me. That, as well as one other experience we had once when we were in former East Germany, and we found a Mass among people who spoke no English whatsoever. They were this was shortly after the wall came down. East Germans spoke Russian, German, and we went this beautiful Missa Cantata. prayed with these people for an hour, and then afterwards realized, my German being more non-existent than your Latin, and my wife says, "Well, we couldn't speak a word other than, I mean, we both struggled to think, wait, how do you say hello? Wait, yes, but we couldn't speak a word or communicate with the 200 so people, but had just prayed together
Yeah.
for an hour." And as you say, that something that transcends merely intellectual arguments, experiences like that. Well, getting maybe near the end of our time together, but perhaps you could address the book in terms of the time. I asked you, why'd you write it now? Well,
Yeah.
probably at the time you wrote many of these lectures, our current events were not quite so clear. But as you know, we are recording this as there's great
Yeah.
anticipation of probably more anticipation about restrictions on the traditional liturgy that have existed since 1969, 1970. And what advice might you have for viewers, those who read the book, about how to prepare for what may be coming, or what type of an attitude we should be cultivating
Yeah.
to be prepared for what appears from various sources to be something likely to happen in the next, say, 5 or 6 weeks?
Yes, well, it's extremely difficult to prepare in practical
Yes,
terms because
yes,
we don't know what's going to be in the
sure,
document. So and also, of course, it's difficult to generalize because people's situations are going to be very different. So
yes,
if it's the case that it's still all about parish churches and non-parish churches,
mm,
then some people are going to be sitting pretty with a non-parish church where they go
yes,
to mass, and some people are going to that's going to be completely out of the question.
yes,
Um, so, I mean, that's just one example of
mm,
how, the details could just throw us in different directions and render all our practical thinking about it,
mm,
preparations into disarray. I mean, there's been some talk about people buying church buildings and things. I think the bigger problem is going to be the priests.
yes,
You can have mass anywhere. I mean, legitimately. I mean, it's
yes,
not breaking canon law. You can have mass any decent place. But obviously you've got to have a priest. So
yes,
um, it's and that priest has to be sustained somehow in a practical way, and also normally he's got to have some kind of jurisdictional. He's got to fit into the hierarchy of the church somehow.
mhm,
So those are problems which we just are going to have to get over when we get to, and it's going to be different for different people, whether it's the fraternities of Pisa or diocesan clergy or whatever.
yes,
I mean, what I've always said, the Latin Mass Society, Voce, we exist to make it possible to have the mass within the structures of the church. So we want to have masses in ordinary churches, with ordinary priests
yes,
and so, but we do not criticize people who go to the SSPX or something. I mean, that's not
mhm.
part of our
Your your brief, yes,
mission
yes,
exactly
yes,
to criticize people who, in a
yes,
way, our work is to show that it's possible or impossible.
mhm.
And what we've shown in the last 15 years is that it's possible in most countries.
Mm.
Well, for a lot of countries
Lot of
anyway.
company, yes,
In fact, I shouldn't say most countries because actually there are dozens of countries in Africa where the bishops are just not interested. So even under Simon Pontificum, but we've made a lot of progress, and it's been really great. And it's been in parish churches, and it's been in shrines, and cardinals have celebrated it, and it's been lovely. And I think we've really made the most of the opportunities which existed.
mm,
And now we're going to continue to make the most of the opportunities, even if they're very, very restricted.
mm,
And people will see whether local Una Voce chapters are able to manage anything. And if they're not, then it'll be up to them to use their judgment about what to do. And that, of course, includes the people who are involved in the Una Voce chapters. I mean,
yes,
they might find that the only thing that they can do for their own and their families' spiritual good is something which is not totally kind of sanctioned
mm,
by the structures of the church. And I think this is a tragedy, and this is
yes,
totally avoidable, and a scandal actually.
mm,
And it's difficult to think of anything else that in which the church has kind of driven people away,
Mm.
people who were manifestly orthodox in their theological views. I mean, ask me to make, a profession of faith like any of the kind of heretics in the past. Who
No.
wants to sort of swear the Athanasian
Yes.
Creed or,
Yes.
or something. Well, I mean, obviously, all traditional Catholics, they'd be happy to do all those things. I mean, that question doesn't even arise. But we've been told we're kind of, bad somehow. So we've got to cease to exist. So I think in the meantime, what we can do is we can pray. And I hope people don't think that this shows that I'm a kind of weasel or a sellout or feeble or anything like that. But I think actually prayer is very powerful, and it does make a difference. And it's been in the past, and it will make a difference now. And it will give us also the discernment to deal with whatever is coming down the track. And also, of course, it may be nothing. It really may be nothing. I mean, it might not happen. All sorts of things happen. The Pope is totally mercurial. I don't think he's ideologically opposed to traditional mass, as a matter of fact. Some people are in the Curia, but I don't think he's one of them. I can't pretend to fully understand what's going on, but he waited 8 years before doing this. It's not a key part of his agenda. And he won't be Pope forever anyway. So we've got a lot to play for.
It's interesting, and once I remember speaking with Bishop Fillet, who is one of the bishops of the Society of St. Pius X, and asking him, sort of, how do you understand Pope Francis? And he said the problem with traditionalists, we have a very difficult time understanding his actions because we are very rooted in acting on principles. And again, sometimes we get those actions wrong, but we're always thinking back to, wait, is this consistent with principles? Is it, even when we're wrong, we're always thinking in that framework. And he just said he's not someone that thinks that way. And the way you put it, he's not ideological is I think a similar concept that he does. It's not saying he does everything completely inconsistently, but he just doesn't think in that same kind of a framework. But he said, which was interesting, he will often facilitate or and even in ways maybe he doesn't appreciate, those who do think in ideological principles adverse to ours. And that's why he said makes it an interesting or very difficult situation to predict, because sometimes he appears to be acting from ideological principles, but they may not actually be his. They may be just other, as you say, in the Curia. So it's a very complex, much more complex than many commentators want to admit that we deal with. But really, some wonderful advice, and I do think those organizations, as I mentioned in the beginning, you walk in the footsteps of the late Michael Davies. But like him, I think you do act from principles. But what I sense in the book and from our conversation, you recognize what many traditionalists don't, that we're not in 1970. And although certainly the actions of those great men and women who went before us are worth knowing because they made great decisions, but decisions that may need to be made in 2023 are very different decisions, because the world is better and worse in some ways than 1970, but is different. And those practical, as you say, at the very family level, what am I going to do for my children, my family? Those decisions are going to be very different. So we wish you success in guiding those organizations and all your work. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is the text that served as the basis for our conversation: The Liturgy, the Family, and the Crisis of Modernity, essays of a traditional Catholic, Dr. Joseph Shaw. The book is available for order online. This is the website of the publisher, Justi Press, a line from the Psalms and from a very common of the Mass, Os Justi. But are there any other ways to purchase the book other than through this website?
Yeah, you can also get it through Amazon. I'm not sure I recommend that or not, but there it is. And if you're in the UK, buy it from the Latin Mass Society's online bookshop.
Ah, very good. So this is the U.S. website. As you'll see, it's
Yeah.
in U.S. dollars. That'd be a little more expensive in U.K. pounds if we're 1895. But yes, in England too, purchase from the Latin Mass Society. That would be excellent. And I do highly recommend the book. It's very thought provoking. I think it's very useful for those maybe new to traditional Mass who have found it after COVID, as many people did, or during
Yeah.
COVID. But even for those who maybe have been in working in the movement for decades, there's some wonderful insights that are very fresh and new. Again, one other thought that came to my mind as reading it is the steward who brings forth both old and new. That you will find old arguments and new. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Brian.
And again, if our viewers, if you've enjoyed this free content, we ask you to consider helping us. Unlike many other outlets, we don't have the money to pay to promote our free content, so we rely on you to like these videos, forward them, or these audio podcasts, and to do that work for us, because we, as the small apostolate that we are, we rely on your help. And if you've enjoyed it even more, please consider a subscription to our monthly newspaper, Catholic Family News, which is available both electronically and in print format through our website, which you'll see at the very end of this video. So thank you all for your attention, and God bless you.